Okay, let's move on then to Israel.
Okay, there have been many things happening in Israel, and here we see 100,000 Israelis gathering in Jerusalem to protest the judicial overhaul amidst a mass strike. So there are major eruptions, and we'll get to just how serious this is becoming. But first, let's go back to 2020. We see here Yair Netanyahu, son of Bibi Netanyahu. He tweets, "To my international followers, here's a great explanation about the show trial that starts today in Israel." And he quotes Mark Levine talking about today in Israel marks one last effort by the left in Israel to remove and destroy Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The Supreme Court in Israel is extremely liberal and hostile to Netanyahu. So we've got a conflict between the democratically elected leader, whatever you think that means or signifies, but he was a democratically elected leader, and the court system, which is meant to provide a limitation, a restriction on the scope for a democratically elected leader to change the country. Some sort of check, some sort of balance. And there's a war between the two going on back in 2020. This war then developed, and we see from 2022, the Times of Israel reports the result of the election. Likud voters just handed Netanyahu a mandate to remake the judicial system. So essentially, we've got a challenge here. Who runs the country? Is it the courts? Is it the parliament? Now, Haaretz is reporting here, why are hundreds of thousands of Israelis protesting, and does Netanyahu care? So the protests, what are they about? They write that Israel's new government, the most religious and far right in the country's history, is pushing through the Knesset a plan to significantly change the balance of power between the three branches of government. The legislation gives the Prime Minister and his or her government, via the legislature they control, the power to override Supreme Court decisions. It also limits the court's ability to strike down legislation that infringes on human and civil rights, while giving the government complete control over judicial appointments. So this is one branch of the government very much looking to dominate another as part of this ongoing struggle between left and right through the organs of the state. Haaretz continues, the plan has aroused strong opposition because it gives almost absolute power to the government, removing the checks and balances that have safeguarded Israel's democracy for decades. And it comments that there's no written constitution in Israel, and this is part of the issue. There's no clarity on this issue. The plan has been criticised by the entire legal establishment, the Attorney General, the Supreme Court Chief, and dozens of former justices calling it a threat to Israeli democracy. It has drawn unusual warnings from Israel's allies abroad. So what we have here is a conflict, a fight over who controls Leviathan, right, between the political left and the political right. Political left and right in Israel being defined almost wholly by the interaction with the Palestinian Arab population. The left wish to, generally speaking, to reach an agreement, a settlement, some sort of negotiated peace, and the right viewing essentially the Arabs as not capable of reaching a peace and needing to be essentially expelled or dominated militarily, and they're interested in might and control, and they cite safety and security as a justification for this. So that's the point I'm making, is the left-right split in Israel is not primarily about economics, it's not primarily about tax, it's primarily about Arab-Israeli relations. So back to Haaretz. To give you an idea of how splintered Israeli society is and how severe this particular conflict is starting to look, Haaretz has got an opinion piece here. In Israel, a civil war is no longer unthinkable. The Netanyahu government bulldozes through its judicial legislation. Talk amongst Israelis has turned to visceral fear and intransigence. Both sides feel this is the moment they win or lose their country. And the author here writes, over the last few days, I found myself in conversations I never imagined I'd have, since the since these are conversations with Israelis, everything is couched in semi-humorous tones, but the topic is deadly serious. In various ways, the various ways a civil war might suddenly break out and who would win. If the balloon goes up and civil war begins between supporters of Netanyahu's government and loyalists of the Supreme Court and the judiciary, will law enforcement, the security agencies, and the military take sides? And if so, which? And he says that just thinking about this makes him sick. He says it sounds almost crazy to engage in such speculation in a 75-year-old country, but there hasn't been anything close to a hint of a military coup. Meanwhile, the conscription-based Israel Defense Forces, still widely regarded as a meritocratic people's army, Vanessa Bailey will love that one, but people are wondering, if push comes to shove, whom will this or that unit remain loyal to? So he concludes pointing out that only 4 weeks ago he thought this was nonsense and he didn't think there was any prospect of a civil war. Now he's changing his mind. It gives you an indication how quickly things are moving. He says the Jewish People Policy Institute, a sleepy quasi-governmental think tank, has started to campaign on this. The Institute's president, Mr. Stern, explained to me that he was acting well within the Institute's mandate, as the group's mission is to bolster cohesion in Israel amongst diaspora Jews and between Israel and the diaspora. He's on a mission to prevent Israeli society from breaking down. So this is what we're talking about, the breakdown of the entire society. He continues here, he says, on one side, the strong judiciary has become a symbol for a relatively liberal and secular Israel. The feeling is mirrored on the other side. Many people in the religious Zionist community have been carrying around similar trauma for 17 and a half years since the disengagement from Gaza. They considered the uprooting of communities an unforgivable act by an uncaring establishment, and now is the time to make sure it never happens again. Amongst the ultra-Orthodox, there's a feeling that the current government, which to them symbolises true Jewish spirit, is the historic denouncement of the secular fake Jewishness, whose downfall was always inevitable. I think, in balance, more Israelis still have a greater interest in somehow keeping the ship afloat together, but I'm a lot less certain than I was 4 weeks ago. So this is an issue that we have talked about in the past. Israeli society, Jewish Israeli society, before you even get to the Arab view of it, which is obviously a fundamental divide in viewpoints. But in Jewish Israeli society, the society is hopelessly split between the secular and the religious, between the conservative and the liberal. It's by no means united, to the point that we're now seriously having talks in major national newspapers in Israel about the prospects of civil war and which side, which army units might be on if such a war broke out.
Okay, but David, at the risk of being accused of being anti-Semitic, I just want to suggest that any government which attempts to override the judiciary in this way, well, this has echoes of 1930s Germany, it seems to me, and many other examples of sort of totalitarian situations in past history. It goes beyond just not having a written constitution. I'm not aware of any democratic country on the planet where this type of power grab would be accepted.
It is very fundamentally different from most other countries. And it relates to an issue that perhaps looks familiar if you look back to what's termed the English Civil War period, which was a conflict between Parliament and the King over who has the power to run Leviathan. It's very similar to that. There is an inherent conflict in democracy, because democracy unrestricted is simply the tyranny of 51% over the 49. So most democracies realize that there must be something else, some check, some balance on what a government can do. Now, all through the West, these checks and balances have been under pressure and have been breaking down. You have the long march through the institutions by the left. So these institutions are captured by left-wing views. And here you see in Israel the right pushing back and saying, no, it's democracy. The people want this. and what's the basis that you're denying the people the right to choose? And against this, there's the limitation of saying, well, actually, there are absolute values here that essentially trump democracy, and if we ignore those, then we descend into tyranny. And that conflict is what you're seeing working out here. It's a conflict we had in Britain in the 17th century. It's a conflict they had in America in the 18th century and 19th in some degree, and it's a conflict now being played out in Israel in the 21st century. I think it has the potential to be as divisive, as deeply fracturing there as it has been in other countries at other times.
Okay, thanks, David.